good evening and welcome. And welcome to all 102 of you that are joining us this evening. I'm Don Kinzler. I'm the NDSU Extension Horticulture Agent here in Cass County, and I'm coming to you this evening from my office here in the Cass County Courthouse Annex. And it's great to have all of you join us this evening. I'm going to look forward to talking about overwintering geraniums. And it's a perfect topic for this time of year. We haven't had frost yet. And so I need to bring our own geraniums in to overwinter them, which I'll be doing shortly before we get frost. And I really enjoy these webinars in this series. I'll be doing one next week also on preparing our yards and gardens and lawns for winter time. And to everyone enrolled in this evening's webinar, I'll also be sending you the information for next week's. It's also Tuesday evening, 7 o'clock next week. Now, this evening, our program should last approximately half an hour. And I know the vice presidential debate is this evening, so we should be done in time for anyone to watch that as well. One thing that I really enjoy about these webinars, it allows you to join from the comfort of your own home. And for those of you that have small children, you don't even need to get a sitter, as the cartoon indicates. All right, let's talk geraniums. Now, geraniums are just one of the most wonderful plants for containers. They just do so well. And when my wife and I had our garden center, geraniums were one of the best sellers. We used to raise about 20,000 of them for sale. They just bloom so very vigorously, and they respond so well to the care that we give. And it's nice to overwinter these. It's relatively easy with the method that we'll show, relatively easy to get these to overwinter so that we can have them again next spring. And as I always like to mention, the geraniums that Mary and I overwinter, it's not just about getting geraniums on the cheap, but it allows us to save a little money on geraniums so that we can spend a little money at the garden centers over there. I'd like a few more plum trees in our yard, and so by overwintering our own geraniums, I can spend a little more money at the garden centers on some other material. And it's also kind of a fun hobby. Now, geraniums do so well in planters. And of course, this is a very beautiful planter that you see. But if you notice the geraniums that are in there are hidden a little bit. I mean, it's very beautiful. But if you've never tried geraniums just on their own in a separate pot, they really shine. Geraniums can grow so beautifully and so robust, but if they're with too many other things, sometimes the other plants, such as the vining things, will outcompete. So we can get more mileage from our geraniums if we're a little careful what we combine with them so that the other plants don't overshadow the geraniums. And so over the years, we've come to growing many just plain pots of geraniums. They mound themselves out so well and really do just beautifully. And there's so many beautiful colors of geraniums. The two-tone types, apple blossom, that's one of my favorites. My mother always had an apple blossom geranium, and my first grade teacher even had an apple blossom geranium blooming in the window in first and second grade. So they're beautiful. And did you know there's even a geranium called a tulip geranium? Look at the blossoms on that. The individual little florets are shaped like tulips. And once in a while, especially at the locally owned garden centers, you'll even find tulip geraniums. They're a little bit rare, but if you look at the locally owned, you'll oftentimes find them. And of course, the ivy geraniums. Mary and I, the window boxes at the back of our house, these are not photos of ours, but this type of ivy geranium, which is called a cascade geranium, we take from cuttings, bring them in each year, and each year then window boxes by our back kitchen just do beautifully. So that's another wonderful type. Now, before we talk about overwintering geraniums, we need to talk about the two different classes of geraniums, two different types based on how they're propagated or started. Okay. The first type that you see in the photo here, this big greenhouse full, are called zonal geraniums. They're vegetatively propagated. That means they're propagated by cuttings. So when you go to a garden center and see these geraniums, they were all started from cuttings. Now that allows each of the plants to be true to flower type. And this is how the best geraniums are produced vegetatively by cuttings. So when you go to the garden center and buy them, they've all been propagated from cuttings. And they are the type that have the biggest, fullest, kind of fluffiest blossoms. Those are all propagated by cuttings. Now, the other type of geraniums, which are nice too, are the seed-grown geraniums. They're never quite as full. The blossom is never quite as full, not quite as husky. They tend to be the ones that are maybe on sale at the garden centers or on sale at the national chain stores. And the blossoms are a little more open, usually not quite as full. And so the reason I mention these two different types of geraniums is that when we go to winter geraniums or overwinter geraniums, I like to put that work, and it's fun work, I like to put that work into growing the zonal geraniums, the cutting grown geraniums, rather than trying to overwinter these seed grown geraniums, because the cutting grown ones, and let me back up just a little bit here again. The cutting grown vegetatively propagated ones, which are most of the ones sold at local garden centers, are just so beautiful. And so they are so nice to winter. So again, when we're talking about saving geraniums over winter, we're generally talking about wintering the vegetatively grown zonal geraniums. Now, as we go through the webinar here, if you have any questions, you can type them into either the chat or the Q&A box, either one. And then at the end of the program, I'll answer any of the questions that you might have. During these webinars, in case this is the first one you've joined, everyone's microphone is automatically muted, as are your cameras. So the way we can communicate questions is through the chat box, and I'll address those at the end. All right, let's get right into saving geraniums. How are we going to winter these geraniums that we've got out in our pots and planters? How are we going to get them to survive winter so we can put those back out again next spring? And it's a shame, beautiful geraniums. Ours are looking really nice, and it's kind of a shame to just let them freeze. And so anyway, here are 3 ways to save and keep your geraniums over winter. And we're going to talk briefly about each of these 3 different ones. Okay, we can take cuttings. We can take our own cuttings off of the mother plants and get them to root, and then we can grow those new plants all winter. And I'll show you the process for that in a minute. Okay. Another way is to keep the mother plants. The plants that are currently growing outside in your pots and planters, we can take those indoors and grow them over winter. Now, if you've got them in great big pots and tubs, of course, we can't haul that whole thing indoors. So I'll show you the method for keeping those mother plants in a really fairly easy to grow situation. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. Or there's another method. This is the method that our moms and grandmothers used to do quite often, and that is to let the geraniums go dormant. You can store them over winter because geraniums have the means to go partially dormant. They just kind of slow growth, and you can kind of put them in a basement. But anyway, we'll talk more about that in a minute too. So let's go through each of these ways to save our geraniums. Okay, the first way is to take cuttings. And now we're at October 1st today. The preferred time to take cuttings of the geraniums and get them to root would have been late August or early September. Now, do I have our cuttings taken yet? No, I don't. I'm going to take some, and it just means we'll take cuttings now, get them to root, get them indoors. But it means that when we have some frost, I'll need to get these taken and put in. So it's not too late to take cuttings yet. Okay, here's the process for taking cuttings of the geranium plants that you have outdoors right now. Okay, the preferred cutting that I'm holding is shown on the right-hand side of the screen. The preferred cuttings are from the tips of geraniums. So you see kind of the growing point there, the tip, the outer tips of the branches, and that's only maybe about 3 inches long. And I've taken off the lower leaves. So the preferred cutting has about 2 major leaves and then the little growing point in the center. Now, instead of cutting these with a scissors or a knife, which can spread bacteria and rotting organisms onto that surface, instead just snap them off at the point that you want them. So on the mother plant, identify those nice tips like that, just snap off the cutting, and there you have a cutting. Take off the lower leaves. You can kind of see the scars there where I've taken off the lower leaves. And that is very much like the cuttings that a commercial greenhouse would take and use, just like that. Okay, so there's the ideal cutting. Now, are we going to root these in water or are we going to do differently? Well, I know my mom and grandma rooted things in water. In the picture there, you see coleus, which roots really easy. But and this will work with geraniums, but geraniums can easily rot in water. And so rooting the cuttings in a potting mix, a high quality potting mix, probably the most common that we see is the Miracle Grow potting mix. That works well to root cuttings. Sometimes I'll take a little sand and mix that in too with the Miracle Grow potting mix. That works beautifully too. You could also use perlite, vermiculite. Um, so anyway, how come we're rooting these in a mix like that? And why not just slip them in a glass of water? Well, rotting is more prevalent in a glass of water, but also if you take a look at the photo there showing the rooted coleus cuttings, the cutting that was rooted in the potting mix, the roots are more fibrous, there's more of them, whereas the water roots are a little more sparse, and roots that are developed in water are kind of used to being in water, whereas roots that develop in a potting mix are used to being in potting mix. So when you go to pot up these cuttings, there will be less transplant shock if the roots have formed in potting mix. And so the cuttings just seem to take off better. So that's why commercially, and we can do it in the home too, the cuttings are rooted down in a mix. So there you see all kinds of cuttings down in, and you just insert them down in so that the lower part, where you snapped off the lower leaves, is below. Now, Mary and I used to root a fair amount of cuttings in the garden center, and the directions would always come with the cuttings, and the directions said, do not use rooting powders. Now, on some difficult to root things, rooting hormones, rooting powders do help stimulate roots. But the directions that we always received indicated that rooting powders could damage the geranium cuttings. So they recommended, which is what we've always followed, just rooting the cuttings without rooting powders. So now these are from our basement. These are from a couple of years ago. If you see kind of the center photo there, I'm rooting cuttings under fluorescent lights in our basement. LEDs work beautifully too. So I'm rooting those. If our basement is chilly, I'll put them on a heat mat, a propagation mat, the special mats that are made for seedlings. That also works for cuttings. The bottom heat will stimulate rooting on those too. So after you've put the cutting down in the mix like that, water it well, make sure they don't wiggle, because if they wiggle, the roots will kind of wear off. And so there you see some cuttings, and they've rooted after about 3 weeks. Nice roots showing. Isn't that a beautiful cutting? And so that is all ready to go into a little bit larger pot. Now, the pots that we prefer, and here you see a whole tray of pots. If you look carefully, you can see these are 4-inch square pots. Now, I always like to fill up the pots all the way up to the top of the pot, because when I go to water those, it's going to settle a little bit. So I like to make sure that the pot is well filled to begin with. So there, with one hand, I've dug a little hole in the pot, the square pot. I'm inserting the cutting into that and firming it down. And there is a potted geranium cutting, all set to grow on. Now, the pots that I use are a 4.5-inch square pot. Um, they could be round pots, the shape doesn't matter. But these would be similar to the same size pot that the garden centers sell the geraniums in. And I know most of us gardeners have a whole garage full of pots and trays and different things that we've collected. So those 4.5-inch pots that you saved from when you bought geraniums, those are ideal to grow the cuttings on. And under fluorescent lights, this is shown in our basement from a couple of years ago. See all the cuttings potted up like that, just ready to grow. This was when we were still using fluorescent light tubes, just ordinary shop light fixtures that had 2 tubes in. It can be cool white or one cool, one warm. But in the meantime, we've transitioned to LED lights, just regular LED white type lights. You can get plant lights if you want, but even just the plain LED lights work very well also. Then, this is not in our window, but this would be similar to then by spring, you'll have a nice plant. So that is starting geraniums from cuttings. You get the cutting to root, you pot it up, grow it either under lights or in a window, and by next spring, you'll have a greenhouse quality plant to put out again in your pots and planters. Okay, so that was the first method. You take cuttings from the plants you have outdoors. All right, then the next method is you actually save the plants that you've got outdoors. You save the mother plant. If you're really thrifty, you can take cuttings from the plant, get those to root, but don't throw out the mother plant. You can bring those in too. So even if you opt not to take cuttings, here's a way to bring in the mother plants that you've got out in your pots and planters. Some falls I get busy and I don't always get new cuttings taken. So last year I didn't. I didn't get any cuttings taken, but we brought in the plants. And Mary and I always winter about 100 geraniums. That's our goal, is to always have at least 100 geraniums growing in those 4-inch square pots. Okay, so how do you get a big geranium that's growing outside? How do you get those indoors and get them to overwinter? So here's what we do. Before frost, I lift the plant out of the big planters that they're in. So there you see one that I've lifted on out. Okay. And then I cut them way back to only about maybe 2 to 3 inches above the root line. And usually there's no leaves left. Or if they're kind of yellowish leaves, I just take those leaves off, snap them off. And that gives me a manageable plant. You see, if I tried to bring in that great big massive plant and pot it up, well, it's probably going to have shock and kind of the leaves are going to turn yellow anyway. But by reducing the size of it, I can get it into a small, manageable size pot. By cutting back, it's going to branch out beautifully, produce nice new growth, and by the next spring, you're going to have a beautiful little plant all ready to start again. Okay, so there we've got that plant taken up out of the planter, cut it back. Then I pot it up in, again, a 4.5 inch square pot. And Miracle Grow potting mix works well. Maybe you've got another brand from a garden center you like. And after a few weeks, look, that plant, that mother plant that I dug up with the roots and the pretty big stems already, uh, it sent out new leaves. And so I will grow these under fluorescent lights or LED lights all winter long. And gosh, they start blooming by about January, and our basement is just wonderful with blooms. Now, you could do this in a sunny window too. You don't have to have them in the basement under fluorescent lights. You can grow those plants in a sunny window. My grandma always had geraniums blooming in the wintertime in her south window. And so you see there we have what was a kind of a big cumbersome geranium. We have it reduced down into manageable size, and it's started nice new bushy growth. We'll grow it through the winter time, and usually around March, see how nice they're looking already at that point, making nice plants. And let me back up just a little bit. Around March or so, around March or so, they're pretty good size. And so I always give them a bit of a trim in March so that by May, mid-May, end of May, when you're ready to pot up your planters outdoors, there'll be a nice, compact, bushy plant that will rival anything you buy at a garden center. And they'll maybe even have some beautiful blossoms that you can have in time for Memorial Day on them. So you see the way that I've taken a pretty good size geranium plant out of our outdoor planters, cut it way back, pot it up, put it under lights in the basement or in a windowsill. It branches beautifully. Trim it back in March, give it a little haircut, and then by May, you've got a greenhouse quality plant again. So how many years can you keep the same plants like that? Keep doing that. Well, I remember when I was giving a talk up in Grand Forks, a lady in Grand Forks said she's been doing it for 40 years with the same geranium. And after a while, they do get kind of woody, but you can certainly do this for quite a number of years. Every number of years, I don't know, I'd say maybe 4 or 5 years, I would take some fresh cuttings. And at that point, if these mother plants that you're bringing in and out each year, cutting back, potting up, if they're getting kind of awfully woody stems, then it's maybe time to start a fresh crop of cuttings and start the process all over. Now, if you have brought in geraniums and just potted them up and put them in a windowsill, these are not ours, but there's some photos I got online. In about March or so, you really should cut them back. There you see some that have been cut back fairly drastically. And that's good because they'll bush out nice. So any that you do bring in like that, that are fairly good size, by March or so, do give them a drastic cutback, and then they'll branch nicely, maybe fertilize them at the same time, and then you'll have beautiful plants again for May. Now, on to the third type that I mentioned, the third way that we could overwinter geraniums. And so you do see people talking about this way online. I saw on Facebook, a Facebook group was talking about how to bring geraniums in and get them to overwinter. And I noticed a few people were talking about this way. Geraniums are a little unique in plants that they can go semi-dormant. Okay. When people used to have root cellars that would stay, oh, maybe 40 degrees and lots of humidity, people would actually hang up geraniums upside down in their root cellars. The humidity would give just the right amount of moisture to the roots. The leaves would probably turn yellow, but then by spring, you could pot those up and they would grow. Now, the days of the root cellars are kind of long gone, so many don't have a spot to do that with. Others will try putting them in a paper bag because they don't have that humid root cellar atmosphere. Putting them in a paper bag, shaking off all the dirt, putting them in a paper bag for winter time. Some people have even shook off all the soil and put them in cardboard boxes down in a cool spot. Others have kind of potted them up a little bit and then stuck them down in a cool basement, and just let them kind of go like that. Maybe once a month, sprinkle a little water on. And that has worked for people. These methods of letting them go semi-dormant, these are the methods that many people say it didn't work for them. And so this is not nearly as sure of a way as keeping them growing all winter long. And so if you really do want a little more certain way of overwintering your geraniums, potting them up and keeping them growing all winter long is the surest way of getting them to overwinter. But if you've got a bunch of geraniums, don't have anything to lose, well, maybe try one of these semi-dormant ways. If you had a garage that doesn't freeze, you could probably put them in there. And again, the key is to keep the roots a little bit hydrated, but not really wet, wet. Now, if you do opt for keeping them semi-dormant like that, in about March, they need to be potted up. For example, if you just kept them dormant like that until May, then in May, if you plant them out, they've got to start growth and branching out. Whereas if you in May pot them, or in March, excuse me, if in March you pot them up, then they can start a little extra growth. So again, of the ways that I like, every once in a while, start some fresh cuttings, root those, grow those. I really like the method number two that I described, where you save the mother plant, reduce the size, pot it up, keep it growing, and that really is highly successful. It does depend, though, that you've got either a window or a spot that you can put them under lights, but that really does work quite well. And so anyway, that's how I offer three different methods. But again, if you do the dormant method as shown here, these people have brought the pots up kind of out of the basement. Again, they should be cut back and gotten to grow. So where are we exactly, as one bee says to the other there? All right. Well, we're at the point where I'm going to just quickly give a few hints on overall geranium. The geranium care. Okay, potting mix. Instead of using outdoor garden soil, just a good high quality potting mix. One from the local garden center is great. They really thrive in a good potting mix. Fertilizer. Geraniums respond very well to fertilizing. The more the steady rate of nutrition gives the blossoms just come out during the growing season so much more. And so one way is to add Osmocote to the potting mix. Now, many of the potting mixes, such as the Miracle Grow mix, already have that timed release. But if you're ever reusing potting mix, like Mary and I do, we reuse a lot of potting mix, that fertilizer that was in that mix is gone after a year. So we can recharge it by using those timed release, such as Osmocote granules, or fertilizing with the Miracle Grow plant food or another brand. Schultz is another brand that you see oftentimes on the market. There are many good water soluble type fertilizers. How often should we fertilize geraniums? Well, once a week isn't too often during the growing season. That really stimulates the bud production. And even if the potting mix has fertilizer in it, when you read the directions on the bag, it says that it can be supplemented with water-soluble fertilizer. So by all means, even if your potting mix has fertilizer in it, do use the water-soluble type as well every 1 to 2 weeks. All right, and then another little care tip. This also applies to the geraniums that you're growing indoors during winter. As the blossoms fade, remove them, called deadheading. And a good way, rather than snipping them off with the scissors, which leaves kind of a dry stem, is just to snap them off. They'll come off nicely. If we leave the blossoms on, it can foster different rot type, like botrytis type blight. Now, outdoors, heat really does stress geraniums. They'd rather have it cool. Temperatures in the 70s would be nice. So, hot afternoon sun on our summer days can be stressful. So sometimes we need to pick the right situation, the right site for geraniums. All right. If you have any questions about anything, feel free to jot down my email address there, donald.kinsler@ndsu.edu. And now I'm going to take a look at the questions here in the chat box. We've got a few. And as I promised, I'd try to keep this to around a half an hour. And so again, thank you to all 119 of you who joined. That's awesome. So let's take a look at the questions. And if anybody does need to leave, I won't be offended. Again, to everyone, I will send next week's webinar information, which is on getting the yard, garden, flower beds, and lawn ready for fall and the end of the season. Okay, so now let me take a look at the questions here. All right, the first question is, if you start those plants like cuttings, what do you recommend for the 2 to 3 weeks that people are away for winter? How about using the plastic terrarium technique? Loved that tip from the past. Yes, geraniums would rather be kept on the dry side rather than the too wet side. So 2 to 3 weeks, they will withstand going 2 to 3 weeks without water. Enclose them in a big bubble, a big plastic bag with some air punched in. And if you water them before you go, I have no doubt that they would stay fine for 2 to 3 weeks. They would rather be, like I say, they'd rather dry out well. If we're keeping geraniums continually too wet, they would resent that more than drying out good. Okay, next question. You start cuttings in soil and not water. Is this true for coleus also? I usually start in water. Coleus root very, very rapidly. They'll root well in water. Sometimes try the mix. I like the mixture, potting mix for coleus because I feel that they transplant better. But water works well for coleus too. But sometimes experiment a little. I've had a little less transplant shock even with coleus started in a potting type mix. Do you water them during the winter, the geraniums? Yes, the geraniums that you are growing under lights or in a window, they're actively growing, and so you do water them during the winter time. And you water them kind of like you would a house plant, except keeping in mind that geraniums like to dry out thoroughly in between waterings. So when I water, and again, we're growing ours in the basement under lights. When I water, I apply enough so that it wets the entire soil ball in the pot, but then I let that dry out fairly thoroughly. If I stick my finger in up to the first joint and feel some moisture, it's wet enough down in the root zone. So I let them dry out well in between. So in our own situation in the basement, I'm watering the geraniums maybe once every 2 weeks or so during the winter time. And of course, in the basement, it's cool, and so they don't dry out well. Can you use the same soil when starting the cuttings? Yes, a good, a good high quality, all-purpose potting mix is the same mix that you can root cuttings in and the same mix that you can grow them in the pots. Or you could take and just to make the rooting soil a little lighter, you can add perlite, vermiculite, maybe a little sand if you want. But the same potting mix can be used. The main thing is that, especially for starting the cuttings, that you don't use one of the heavy bargain type potting mixes that just get so wet and heavy. There's just not enough air in them for the rooting. Have you done any programs on wintering begonias? I haven't done any programs specifically on those. The begonias that winter so beautifully are the wax leaf, which are also called the fibrous rooted begonias. Those work beautifully to bring indoors, lift them up out of the planters, pot them up, and grow them either under lights or in a window. The nonstop or the tuberous type begonias are a little trickier. Any information for growing the taller pillar geraniums? Now Mary and I used to enjoy growing the pillar type or the tower geraniums. Those are geranium specific varieties that are capable of growing quite tall in a pot and usually trained up on a stick or a stake kind of tied to that. And so for wintering those, you can winter that thing. Hopefully it's in a size pot you can bring on in. You can trim them back, but try to maintain that center columnar pillar type habit. And so rather than cutting way back, you're kind of removing, trimming it up somewhat, but keeping that upright columnar habit. How many hours of LED light for best success? Yeah, geraniums are much like almost any plant or seedlings that you grow under lights. And it's easy to remember. I remember it this way. So, okay, how many hours of light? How many hours of dark? I remember it this way. The recommended for humans is to get 8 hours of sleep, dark, per night. Plants are the same way. So 16 hours of light, 8 hours of dark. So if you set your plant light timers for that, works well. So the plants like the same amount of sleep that we do. Fertilize now before winter. Yes, when potting them up this time of year to winter them, I would definitely fertilize them. But then during the winter time, especially if you use a potting mix that has fertilizer in, that's almost enough. But then in March, when we want to get that nice flush of growth in preparation for May, for a beautiful plant for May setting out, then start fertilizing a little heavier with the water soluble type in March. Okay. How do you make sure no pests are coming along inside the house? Um, Now, if you noticed when I bare rooted those, uh, when I bare rooted there we go. When I bare rooted the geraniums in preparation for potting them up, one step that I didn't show is I like to dunk the whole thing in water, a tub of water, both the roots and the leaves. That will help dislodge anything. On the upside, geraniums they aren't the preferred host of many insects. Geraniums, of course, are quite fragrant, and it seems that there aren't too many insects that hitch a ride on the geraniums, but I still dip those down in a pot full of water. Let's see, a few more. Uh, Once the plant is established and ready to move outdoors, do geraniums like to be root bound or do they like generous room? Now, I like that. I like that statement, root bound. Geraniums do like to be root bound. If you notice when I take up that mother plant out of the big pots and put them down in, I'm putting that root in a relatively small pot, a 4.5 inch pot. And so they are they are getting reduced down and becoming kind of pot bound. Geraniums like that. But then once you have that nice potted plant, similar to what you'd buy at the garden center in May, then they like being put out into a bigger pot. And so in the indoors, they definitely like to be pot bound in a relatively small pot, but then outdoors, they like a little more generous space. Do you let the soil dry out when rooting cuttings? Now, when trying to induce roots on a cutting, you need to keep it somewhat moist, not overly soaking wet, but it can't dry out either. Rooting the cuttings definitely takes some experience, a little bit of trial and error, but they don't want to be kept continually wet when they're being rooted, but they can't become too dry either. Next question, would I use Miracle-Gro with fertilizer in to pot them using method 2? And yes, the Miracle-Gro potting mix that has the fertilizer beads in works very well to pot them up in using that method. Hey, another question. I brought the mother plant in 1 year, but it died in the spring when I put it outside. Is there something special that I needed to do to move it outdoors? Um, well, it's always a good idea when moving a plant such as geraniums that's used to being indoors all winter, when moving it outside, the transition can be kind of rough on a plant like that. And so it's a good idea to kind of harden them off. So when taking them out of the house, put them in a sheltered spot outdoors for a few hours each day. Maybe start out in the shade before they get the full brunt of the sun. Oftentimes, what will happen if we move the geraniums directly from outside to the nice sunny spot that you want them in, they'll get wind blown and sunburn, and a lot of the leaves will just kind of get scorched because they aren't used to that. And so, even though you plan to move them into the sun for the first maybe week or so, just move them out into the shade somewhere and start gradually uh, um, getting them accustomed to both the sun and a little bit of wind or air. And so then just gradually move them to the area you want. So start out a little more gradually. But yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Move directly into the spot you want them can be a little too tough on them. Next question, how often do I water the plants that are in the pot and stored downstairs in the basement? The home doesn't have windowsills. So if you'd like the method where you just kind of put them down in a corner of the basement somewhere and kind of ignore them, you barely keep the soil moist. If it's too wet, the roots will rot, but that's kind of the dormant, semi-dormant method. So people that have used that successfully, maybe once a month or so, maybe even a month and a half, just sprinkle a little bit of moisture over the soil so they don't totally desiccate or dry out. But if there's too much moisture, the roots will usually rot on those. If you have a geranium in a planter with a spiky spider plant, can that also just be cut back and left in place? Or would it be better to remove that from the center and try to repot separately? Yes, if the geraniums are in a combination planter, it's much better to take each of the plants out of the combination and winter them separately. Like a spider plant will easily survive winter, but take that out, pot it up, take the geraniums out, pot them up, and do each one individually because the care is a little bit different during the winter. And then next spring, you can join them back together. Scented geraniums, they will winter similarly to all the message we described. I missed option one. Can you briefly review the first method? Option one was growing them by cuttings. Now, everyone, including those of you who tuned in, there were about a total of about 230 of you who registered, and approximately half were able to join in. So I will send the recording to all of you, both who listened, in case you didn't catch everything or want to re-listen. I'll send the recording to all of you, and then also it will be sent to all of those who did register but weren't able to tune in. And I do think we might have gotten to the end of the questions. And now it's about 7:48, and so I want to give you time in case you want to watch the vice presidential debate. And thank you very much. I appreciate your joining the webinar this evening. I'll send the information for next week's webinar as well. And again, thank you again for joining me, and have a good evening. And I wish you success with overwintering your geraniums. Thank you much.